Section 15 of 1916 First Chapters Collection. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1916 First Chapters Collection by Various, Section 15, Tasker Jevons, The Real Story by May Sinclair. Chapter 1. Of course, this story can't be published as it stands just yet, not, if I'm to be decent, for another generation, because, thank heaven, they're still alive. They've had me there, as they've always had me everywhere. How they managed it, I can't think. I don't mean merely at the end, though that was stupendous, but how they ever managed it. It seems to me they must have taken all the risks, always. I suppose if you asked him, he'd say, that's how. It was certainly the way they managed the business of living. Perhaps it's why they managed it on the whole so well. I remember how when I was shilly-shallying about that last job of mine, he said, take it, take it. If you can risk living at all, my dear fellow, you can risk that. And he added, if I'd only your luck. Well, that's exactly what he did have. He had my luck. I mean, the luck I ought to have had all the time, from the beginning to the very end. But there is one thing he can't take from me, and that is the telling of this story. He can hold it up as long as he lives, as long as she lives, as he has held up pretty nearly everything where I was concerned, but he can't take it from me. He doesn't want it. Even he, with his infernal talent, couldn't do anything with it. Unscrupulous as he was, and I assure you he'd stick at nothing. He'd take his mother's last agony if he wanted it badly enough. Indecent as he was, he'd stick at that. I don't mean he couldn't take his wife, part of her anyhow, at a pinch, and I don't mean he couldn't take himself, his own emotions, his own eccentricities if he happened to want them, and his own meannesses if nobody else's, so to speak, would do. But he couldn't and wouldn't take his own big things, particularly not that last thing. When I say that I can't publish this story yet as it stands, I'm not forgetting that I have published the end of it already, but only in the way of business. To publish that sort of thing was what I went out for. It was all part of my special correspondence job. And when you think that it was just touch and go, why, if I hadn't bucked up and taken that job when he told me to, I might have missed him. No amount of hearing about him would have been the same thing. I had to see him. What I wrote then doesn't count. I had to tell what I saw just after I had seen it. I had to take it as I saw it, a fragment snapped off from the rest of him and dated October 11th, 1914, as if it didn't belong to him, as if he were only another splendid instance. And of course I had to leave her out. Told like that, it didn't amount to much. This is the real telling. I must get away from the end, right back to the beginning, I suppose, to be accurate. The very beginning was the day I first met him in 1906. No, 1905 it must have been. It was at Blackheath Football Ground, the last match of the season, when Woolwich Arsenal played East Kent and beat them by 2 goals and a try. He was there as a representative of the press, doing the match for some sporting paper. He held me up at the barrier, yes, he held me up in the first moment of our acquaintance, while he fumbled for his pass. He had given the word press with an exaggerated aplomb that showed he was young to his job, and the gatekeeper challenged him. It was, in fact, the exquisite self-consciousness of the little man that made me look at him, and he caught me looking at him. He blushed, caught himself blushing, and smiled to himself with the most delicious appreciation of his own absurdity. And as he stood there fumbling and holding me up while he argued with the gatekeeper, who didn't know him, I got his engaging twinkle. It was as if he looked at me and said, "See me swank just then? Funny, wasn't it?" He hung about on the edge of the crowd for a while with his hands in his pockets, sucking his little blond mustache and looking dreamy and rather incompetent. I was a full-blown journalist even then, and I remember feeling a sort of pity for his youth. He was so obviously on his maiden trip, and obviously, I fancied, doomed never to arrive in any port. Well, I came upon him afterwards at a crisis in the game. He was taking notes in shorthand with a sort of savagery between his tense and concentrated glares at the scrimmage that was then massed in the center of the field. Woolwich Arsenal and East Kent, locked in each other's bodies, now struggled and writhed and butted like two immense beasts welded together by the impact of their battle, now swayed and quivered and snorted as one beast torn by a solitary and mysterious rage. Self-consciousness had vanished from my man. He stood leaning forward with his legs a little apart. His boyish face was deeply flushed. He had sucked and bitten his blond mustache into a wisp. He was breathing heavily with his mouth ajar. His very large and conspicuous blue eyes glittered with a sort of passion. He wore those eyes in his odd little ugly face like some inappropriate decoration. All these symptoms declared that he was on. They made up a look that I was soon to know him by. I remember marveling at his excitement. I remember also discussing the match with him as we went back to town. It must have been then that he began to tell me about himself, that his name was James Tasker Jevons, that he lived or hoped to live by going about the country and reporting the big cricket and football matches. At least he called it reporting. I shouldn't think there has ever been any reporting like it before or since. I told him I was out for my paper, the Morning Standard, too. Not exactly reporting in his sense. I little knew what his sense was when I put it that way. And there I left it. You see, I didn't want to rub it into the poor chap that the stranger he had been unfolding himself to so quaintly was a cut above his job. But he saw through it. I don't know how he managed to convey to me that my delicacy needn't suffer. Anyhow, he must have had some scruples of his own, since he waited for another context before remarking quietly that what I was doing now he would be doing in another 6 months. And he was. These things, he said, took time, and he gave himself 6 months. Yes, in less than 6 months he was holding me up again in my own paper. I had to wait till he was out before I could get in. He didn't seem to boast so much as to trace for my benefit the path of some natural force, some upward tending indestructible energy that happened to be him. All this I remember, but I cannot remember by what stages we arrived at dining together, as we did that night in a little restaurant in Soho. Perhaps there was no stages. We may have simply leaped by one bound at that consummation. He had swung himself into my compartment as the train was leaving the platform at Blackheath, so I suppose it was destiny. After that I was tempted to conceive that he fastened on me on something that he had need of, but I think it was rather that I fell to his mysterious attraction. While we dined, he informed me further that he had been reporting football matches for 6 weeks. Before that, he had been proofreader for a firm of printers for about a year. Before that, he had been a compositor. And before that again, he had worked in an office with his father, who was registrar of births, marriages, and deaths for some parish down in Hertfordshire. He chucked that because he found that the registration of births, marriages, and deaths was spoiling his handwriting quite as much as his handwriting was spoiling the registration of births, marriages, and deaths. He was, he said, cultivating a careless, scholarly hand. He liked his present job because it took him out pretty often into the open air. Also, he liked looking on at football matches and prize fights. He said it made him feel manly. You should have seen him sitting there and telling me these things in a gentle, throaty, and rather thick voice, with a Cockney accent and a sort of tenor ring in it, and a queer, humorous intonation that was like an audible twinkle, as if he saw himself as he thought I must see him, mainly in the light of absurdity. You should have seen his face, its thin cheeks, its vivid flush, its queer, inquisitive, contradictory nose that showed a slender, high bridge and a tilted, pointed end in profile and 3/4, and turned suddenly, all broad and blunt in a full view, and his mouth, that stood ajar with excitement, and even in moments of quiescence failed to hide the tips of two rather prominent white teeth pressed down on the lower lip. I don't say there was anything unmanly about Jevons's figure, he wasn't noticeably undersized, or about his mouth and jaw. I knew a great general with a mouth and jaw like that, and he was one of the handsomest figures in the service. I'm not hinting at anything like effeminacy in Jevons, only at a certain oddity that really saved him. If he'd been handsome, he'd have been dreadful. His flush, his decorative eyes, his dark eyebrows and eyelashes, his sleek light brown hair would have made him vulgar. As it was, his queerness gave them a sort of point. I dwell on these physical details because afterwards I found myself continually looking at him as if to see where his charm lay, to see, I suppose, what she saw in him. If anybody had asked me that night what I saw in him myself beyond an ordinary little journalist on the make, I don't suppose I could have told them, but there's no doubt that I felt his charm, or that night would have been the end instead of the beginning. We sat in the restaurant when he had done telling me about himself. I remember we sat quite a long time discussing an English writer, our contemporary, whom I rather considered I had discovered. In those days I used to apply him as an infallible test. Jevons had read every word of him. It was he, in fact, who brought him into the conversation. He confessed afterwards that he had done it on purpose. He had been testing me. Even so, our acquaintance might have lapsed, but for the thing that happened when the waiter came up with the bill. My share of it was 3 and 2pence, and I found myself with only 9pence in my pocket. I had to borrow half a crown from Jevons. You mayn't see anything very dreadful in that. I didn't at the time, and there wasn't. The dreadful thing was that I forgot to pay him back. Yes, something happened that put Jevons and his half-crown out of my head for long enough. I forgot to pay him, and he had to go without his dinner for 3 nights in consequence. It was his last half-crown. He told me this as an immense joke long afterwards, and Viola Thesiger cried. That crying of hers, that childlike softening and breaking down under him, in itself so unexpected I didn't know she could do it, that sudden and innocent catastrophe was the first sign to me that I was done for, wiped out. There wasn't any violence or any hysteria about it, only grief, only pity. It was an entirely simple, gentle, and beautiful performance, and it took place in my rooms after Jevons had left us. But as I say, this was long afterwards. The agony of my undoing was a horribly protracted affair. I needn't say that what happened, I mean the thing that made me forget all about Jevons and his half-crown, was Viola Thesiger. I had his address, but the next day, the day after the match, was Sunday, so I couldn't get the postal order I had meant to send him, and on Monday she walked into my rooms at 10 in the morning. The appointment, I may remark, was for 9:30. I had fixed that early hour for it because I wanted to get it done with. I wasn't going to have my morning murdered with violence when it was 2 hours old. Neither did I intend it to be poisoned by the thought of this interview hanging over me at the end. I had just sent for Pavitt, my man, and told him that if Miss Thesiger called, he was on no account to let her in. He was to say that the appointment was for 9:30 and that Mr. Furnival was now engaged. She would have to call again at 3 if she wished to see him. When engaging a typist, it is as well to begin as you mean to go on, and I was anxious to let Miss Thesiger know at once that I was not a man who would stand any nonsense. I was abominably busy that morning. And Pavitt let her in. It was the first time he had failed in this way. He never explained or apologized for it afterwards. He seemed to think that when I had seen Miss Thesiger, I would see, even more vividly than he did, how impossible it was to do otherwise, unless he had relinquished all claim to manhood and to chivalry. The look he sent me from the threshold as he retreated backwards, drawing the door upon himself like a screen, and shutting me in alone with her, said very plainly, "You may curse, sir, and you may swear, but if you think you'll get out of it any better than I have, You're mistaken. Yes, it was something more than her appearance and her manner, though they, in all conscience, were enough. I do not know what appearance and what manner, if any, are proper to a young woman calling on a young man at his rooms to seek employment. The mere situation may, for all I know, bristle with embarrassments. Anyhow, I can imagine that in some hands it might have moments, let us say, of extreme difficulty on either side. Miss Thesiger's appearance and her manner were perfect, but they didn't suggest by any sign or shade that she was a young woman seeking employment, that she was a young woman seeking anything, but rather that she was a young woman to whom all things naturally came. She approached me very slowly. Her adorable little salutation, with all its maturity, its gravity, was somehow essentially young. She was rather tall, and her figure had the same serious maturity in youth. She carried her small head high, and held her shoulders well back, so that she got a sort of squareness into the divine slope of them. People hadn't begun to slouch forward from the hips in those days. A squareness that agreed somehow with the character of her small face. I didn't know then whether it was a pretty face or not. I dare say it was a bit too odd and square for prettiness, and as for beauty, that had all gone into the lines of her body, which was beautiful, if you like. When you looked carefully, you got a little square white forehead and straight eyebrows of the same darkness as her hair, and very distinct on the white, and eyes also very dark and distinct, and fairly crystalline with youth, and a little white and very young nose that started straight and ended absurdly in a little soft knob that had a sort of kink in it, and a mouth which would have been too large for her face if it hadn't made room for itself by tilting up at the corners, and then a little square white chin and jaw. They were thrust forward, but so lightly and slenderly that it didn't matter. It doesn't sound, does it, as if she could have been pretty, let alone beautiful, and yet she managed that little head of hers and that little odd face so as to give an impression of beauty or of prettiness. It was partly the oddness of the face and head coming on the top of all that symmetry, that perfection, that made the total effect of her so bewildering. I can't find words for the total effect. I don't know that you ever got it all at once, and I certainly didn't get it then. And if I were to tell you that what struck me first about her was something perverse and willful and defiant, this would be misleading. She smiled in her mature, perfunctory manner as she took the chair I gave her. She cast out her muff over my writing table and flung back the furs that covered her breast and shoulders, as if she had come to stay, as if it were 4 o'clock in the afternoon and I had asked her to tea for the first time. I remember saying, "That's right, I'm afraid this room is a bit warm, isn't it?" as if she had done something uninvited and a little unexpected, and I wished to reassure her, as if, too, I desired to assert my position as the giver of assurances. And it was I who needed them, not she. She hadn't been in that room 5 minutes before she had created a situation that bristled with difficulty and danger. To begin with, she was so young. She couldn't have been then a day or older than 21. My first instinct, at least I suppose it was my first, was to send her away, to tell her that I was afraid she wouldn't do, that she was too unpunctual, and that I had found between 9:30 and 10 o'clock somebody who would suit me rather better. Any lie I could think of, so long as I got out of it, so long as I got her out of it. I don't know how it was she so contrived to impress me as being in for something, some impetuous adventure, some enterprise of enormous uncertainty. It may have been because she looked so well cared for and expensive. I do not understand these matters, but her furs and her tailor-made suit of dark cloth and the little black velvet hat with the fur tail in it were not the sort of clothes I had hitherto seen worn by typists seeking for employment, so that I doubted whether financial necessity could have driven her to my door, or else I had a premonition. She herself had none. She was guileless and unaware of taking any risks, and that, I think, was what disturbed me. The situation bristled because she so ignored all difficulty or danger. Please don't imagine that I regarded myself as dangerous or even difficult, or her as being, in any vulgar sense, out for adventure, or as balancing herself even for amusement on any perilous edge. It was not what she was out for. It was, as I say, what she might possibly be in for, and what she would in consequence let me in for, too. She made me feel responsible. "Let me see," I said. "It's typing, isn't it?" I began raking through drawers and pigeonholes, pretending to find her letter and the sample of her work that she had sent me, though I knew all the time that they lay under my hand, hidden by the blotter. I wanted to give myself time. I wanted to create the impression that I was old at this game, that I had to do with scores and scores of young women seeking employment, to make her realize the grim fact of competition, to saturate her with the idea that she was only one of scores and scores, all docketed and pigeonholed, any one of whom might have superior qualities, when it would be easy enough to say, "I'm sorry, but the fact is I rather think I've engaged somebody already." "Yes," she said, "it's typing. I can't do anything else. But if you want shorthand, I could learn it." This gave me an opening. "Well, I'm sorry, but the fact is, did you like what I sent you?" That staggered me. I hadn't allowed for her voice. For a moment I wondered wildly what had she sent me. "Oh, yes, I liked it, but—" I began again. She leaned forward this time, peering under my elbow. The minx! I'm convinced she knew the infernal thing was there. "I see," she said, "you've lost it. Don't bother. I can do another. As long as you liked it, that's all right." I remember thinking violently, "It isn't all right. It's all wrong. And the more I like it, if I do like it, the worse it's going to be." But all I said was, "You wrote from Canterbury, didn't you?" "Yes." It was as if she challenged me with, "Why not? Why shouldn't one write from Canterbury?" And she stuck out her little chin as her eyes opened fire on me at close range. "Do you live there?" I said. "Yes," she corrected herself. "My people live there." "Oh, because in that case, I'm sorry, but the fact is, I'm afraid—" I floundered, and she watched me floundering. Then I plunged. "I must have a typist who lives in London." And I might have added, "a typist who won't open fire on me at close range." "But," she said, "I do. At least I'm going to-morrow evening." I must have sat staring then quite a long time, not at her, but at one of Roland Simpson's sketches on the wall in front of me. She followed, but not quite accurately, the direction of my thoughts. "If you want references, I can give you heaps. General Thesiger's my uncle." "Why? Do you know him?" I had ceased staring. He was not the general I knew, but she had spoken a sufficiently distinguished name. I said as much. "Of course, lots of people know him," she went on with a sort of radiant rapidity, "and he knows lots of people. But I wouldn't write to him if I were you. He'll only be rude and ask you who the devil you are. There's my father, Canon Thesiger. It's no good writing to him either. It'll worry him. And there's—no, you mustn't bother the Archbishop. But there's the Dean. You might write to him. And there's Colonel Braithwaite and Mrs. Braithwaite. They're all dears. You might write to any of them. Only I'd much rather you didn't." "Why?" I said. I thought I was entitled to ask why. "Because," she said, "it'll only mean a lot more bother for me." I believe I meditated on this before I asked her, "Why should it?" "Because it isn't easy to get away and earn your own living in this country. And they'll try, poor dears, to stop me. And they can't." "If they don't," I said, "are you sure it won't mean a lot of bother for them?" "Not," she said gravely, "if they're left alone and not worried. It will, of course, if you go and write and stir them all up again." "I see. For the moment, then, they are placated." "Rather." I wondered on what grounds. "We settled that last night." "Then," I said, "forgive my asking so many questions, your people know you had this appointment with me?" Her eyebrows took a little tortured twist in her pity for my stupidity. "Oh, no. That would have upset them all for nothing. It doesn't do to worry them with silly details. You see, they don't know anything about you." It was exquisite, the innocence with which she brought it out. "But," I insisted. That's rather my point. You don't know anything about me either, do you? Yes, I do. I knew, she said, the minute I came into the room. If it comes to that, you don't know anything about me. I said I did. I knew the minute she came into the room. And she faced me with, well then, you see, as if that settled it. I suppose it did settle it. I must have decided that since nobody could stop her, and I wasn't after all a villain, if she insisted on being somebody's typist, she had very much better be mine. You see, she was so young, I wanted to protect her. Not that there was anything helpless and pathetic about her, anything except her innocence, that appealed to me for protection. On the contrary, she struck me as a creature of high courage and defiance. That, of course, was what constituted the danger. She would insist on taking risks. Presently I heard myself saying, yes, the Close, Canterbury, I've got that, but where am I to find you here? She gave me an address that made me whistle. I asked her if she knew anything whatever about the people of the house. She said she didn't. She had chosen it because it had a nice green door, and there was an Angora cat on the doorstep, a large orange cat with green eyes. Had she actually taken rooms there? No, but she had chosen them. I think she said because they had pretty chintz curtains. She was going to take them now. She had her hand on the door. She was eager, like a child that has got off at last after irritating delay. I closed the door against her precipitate flight. I said I thought we could settle that here, over the telephone, and I settled it. Having settled it, I sent Pavitt, my man, to get rooms for her that afternoon in Hampstead with his sister-in-law, in a house overlooking the heath. I said I couldn't promise her chintz curtains and a green door and an orange Angora cat with green eyes, but I thought she would be fairly comfortable with Mrs. Pavitt. She was. She told me a week later that the Hampstead rooms had chintz curtains, and there was a Persian kitten, too, a blue Persian with yellow eyes. There was, but I didn't tell her who put them there. The kitten alone, it was a purebred Persian, cost me 3 guineas, and to this day she thinks that Pavitt, who brought it to her, found it on the heath. Yet, with all my precautions, there was trouble when Canterbury heard about my typist. She had become my typist, though I had never said a word about engaging her. This, of course, was owing to the criminal secrecy with which Viola conducted her affairs. The minor canon wrote to me as if I had seduced, or was about to seduce, his daughter. He had upset himself by rushing up to take her back to Canterbury and finding that she wouldn't go with him. I think in his excitement he ordered me to give her up. He was a guileless and indeed a holy man, and it's always the guileless and the holy people who raise the uncleanest scandals. And Mrs. Thesiger wrote, and the General and the Dean. And I've no doubt the Archbishop would have written too if I hadn't unearthed my General at his club and asked him if he knew the Thesigers, and found out that he did, and employed him to arrange the horrid business for me as best he could. I said he might tell them that if the girl had been left to them to look after her, she would have got into rooms in, I named the street, and testified to the sinister character of the house. And my General wrote and explained to the other General and to the minor canon what a thoroughly nice chap I was, and how lamentably they had misunderstood what I believed he was pleased to call my relations with Miss Thesiger. I'm not at all sure that he didn't even go farther and stick in a lot about my family and suggest that I was eligible, to the extent that, though my fortunes were still to make, I had, besides private means that enabled me to live in spite of journalism, considerable expectations. He knew an aunt of mine better, it would seem, than I did. In short, that I was a thoroughly nice chap, and that the father of 7 daughters, 5 unmarried, might do far worse than cultivate my acquaintance. He must have gone quite as far as that, or farther, otherwise I couldn't account for the peculiarly tender note that the minor canon put into the letter of apology that he wrote me, still less for the invitation I received by the same post from Mrs. Thesiger to spend Whitsuntide with them at Canterbury. Viola had said she was going home for Whitsuntide. Dear lady, she was herself the daughter of a canon, and she had lived all her life in a cathedral close, and the atmosphere of a cathedral close may foster innocence, but I cannot think it could have been entirely responsible for the kind of indiscretion Mrs. Thesiger was guilty of. Neither do I think Mrs. Thesiger was entirely responsible herself. She is a nice woman, and I'm sure she couldn't have written as she did unless my friend the General had led her to believe that there was some sort of an understanding between me and Viola. But still, for all she knew about me, I might have been a villain. Not perhaps the gross villain the minor canon took me for, but a villain in some profound and subtle way inappreciable to my friend the General. Well, of course I didn't spend Whitsun time with the Thesigers at Canterbury. It would have been sheer waste of Viola. For the worst of all this confounded rumpus was that it made me put off proposing to Viola till she had forgotten all about it. She would never have listened to me while the trail of the scandal still lingered. In fact, it was only the marked coldness of my manner to her just then that saved me. It saved me to suffer. I didn't know it was possible to suffer as she made me suffer. I mean, as they made me, between them. It didn't begin all at once. It didn't begin really for another 3 months, the end of those 6 months that Jevons had given himself. Not even then, not, you may say, for a whole year, because he gave himself another 6 months as soon as he saw her. He was always giving himself these periods of time, as if with his mania for taking risks, he was always having some prodigious bet on himself. I never knew a man back his own enterprises as he did. But until he turned up again, I was happy. I say I, not we. I don't know whether Viola was happy or not, though she looked it. I had enough sense to see that her happiness, if she was happy, had nothing to do with me, except in so far as I was the humble means, under Providence, of the definite escape from Canterbury. For I very soon saw what had been the matter with her. She was one of 9, the youngest, but one of 7 daughters. The minor canon had only been able to educate one of the 7 properly, because he had had a son at Sandhurst and the other was still reading for the bar, which is pretty expensive too if you're as amiably stupid as Bertie Thesiger. I mention Bertie because though he doesn't come into the story, his stupidity and his amiability combined to tighten the situation considerably for Viola. And Mrs. Thesiger had only been able to marry off 2 of her 7 daughters. Of the others, one, the one who had been to Girton, was a high school teacher in Canterbury, and she lived at home. One was a trained nurse and lived at home between cases. That left 3 girls living continually at home, and as Viola put it, eating their heads off. These were the circumstances which Viola, with some omissions, recited by way of justification for her revolt, the fact being that she would have revolted anyway. She was, as I have said, a creature of high courage and vitality, and she was tied up much too tight in that cathedral close, besides being much too well fed, and she longed to do things. To do them with her hands and with her head. She was tired of playing tennis on the velvet lawns of the canons' gardens. She was tired of calling on the canons' wives and talking to their daughters. I am aware that Canterbury is a garrison town, and that other resources and other prospects, I suppose, were open to Viola. But Viola was tired of talking to the garrison. I think she would have been tired in any case, even if the garrison hadn't been bespoken, as it were, by her unmarried sisters. It is, humanly speaking, impossible that even in a garrison town 7 sisters will all marry into the service, as I fatuously suppose Mrs. Thesiger must have realized when she asked me to Canterbury. It always bored Viola to do what her family did, and what her family, just because they did it, expected her to do, and somehow in the long hours spent in the cathedral close she had acquired a taste for what she called literature, what she innocently believed to be literature. She was of an engaging innocence in this respect, so that typing authors' manuscripts appealed to her as a vocation that combined one of the highest forms of cerebral activity with I don't know what glamour of romantic adventure. Her enthusiasm, her veneration for the written word made her an admirable typist, but not all at once. To say that she brought to her really horrible task a respect and meticulous devotion would give you no idea of the child's attitude. It was a blind, savage superstition that would have been exasperating if it had not been so heart-rending. It cleared gradually until it became intelligent cooperation. I trained her for 6 months. I don't suppose I ever worked harder than I did in that first half year of her. I mean, my output was never greater, for every blessed thing I wrote was an excuse for going to see her, or for her coming to see me. It was a perpetual journeying between my rooms in Brunswick Square and her rooms in Hampstead overlooking the Heath. The more I wrote, the more I saw of her. I trained her for 6 months until Jevons was ready for her. When I tell you that she reverenced my performances, you may imagine in what spirit she approached his. For their meeting, as for what happened afterwards, I alone am responsible. I brought it on myself, by sheer quixotic fuss and interference with what, after all, wasn't my affair, for little Jevons most decidedly was not. I might easily have let that sleeping dog lie. He certainly did sleep in some obscure kennel of London. He had slept ever since I had left him at the door of that restaurant in Soho. He slept almost for the 6 months he had then given himself. And then, before, according to his own schedule, he was quite due, he appeared in the columns, in my columns, of the Morning Standard. I had almost forgotten his existence, but when I saw his name, James Tasker Jevons, stick out familiarly under the big headlines, I remembered that that name on a card with an address had been lying in my left-hand writing table drawer all this time. I remembered that it was there because he had lent me half a crown and that I had never paid him. Then he came back to me. He lived again. I sent him a postal order and an apology. I referred, very handsomely, as I thought, to his cuckoo's nesting in my paper. I informed him, in fact, that he did it better than I did, and because I had worked myself up to a pitch of affability and generosity, I asked him to come and see me at such time as he should be free. And because also I was indifferent and lazy and didn't want to be seriously bothered with him, instead of asking him to lunch or dine with me, I said I was generally free myself between 4 and 5. Between 4 and 5 was an hour when Viola was very apt to come in. In the instant that followed the posting of that letter, I saw what I had done, and I wrote to him the next day asking him to dinner in order that he should not come in between 4 and 5. For some weeks, whenever I fancied he was about due at 4 o'clock, I wrote and asked him to dinner. That was how I fastened him to me. There wasn't any sense in which he fastened on me. I wasn't by any means his only hope. I may say at once I was prostrated as any slave before his conversation. I shall never forget the radiance of his twinkle when he told me he had been sacked 3 weeks ago from the sporting paper that had provided him with his sole visible means of subsistence. It was his blessed, only he didn't call it blessed, style that had dished him, the suicidal élan that he brought to the business. He was warned, he said. He was aware that his existence as a reporter hung by the bare thread of statement, wearing thinner and thinner, on which he weaved his fantastic web. His editor told him he was engaged to report football, not to play it with the paper. But he couldn't help it. He had got, he said, the ensanguined habit. Still, I was not to imagine that he bungled things. He jolly well knew his way about. In his wildest flights there was a homing impulse. He was preparing a place for himself all the time. That it happened to be my place didn't seem to afflict him in the least. Like St. Paul, he knew how to abound, and he knew how to abstain. His abstinence, in fact, gave the measure of his abundance. He held himself in for 5 perilous weeks, and when he let himself rip again, it was with a burst that landed him in the front page of the Morning Standard. What he sketched for me had no resemblance to the career of a peaceful man of letters. It was a hot race, a combat as bloody, his own word, as those contests of which he was the delighted eye-witness. He had come thin and worn out of the struggle, but you gathered that he had borne himself in it with coolness and deliberate caution. His phrases produced a false effect of vehemence and excitement. You saw that he had simply followed out a calculated scheme, not one step of which had miscarried, and you felt that his most passionate affairs would be conducted with the same formidable precision. I ought to have felt it, for we were precious soon in the thick of his most passionate affair. I had dined him, I suppose, about 3 times, and I had lunched him twice, and I had had tea with him once in his bedroom. He was living in one room in a street off the Euston Road, and he called it his bedroom because it looked so much more that than anything else. I might have let it go at that, but I didn't. I had seen his bedroom. I took the liberty of inquiring into his finances. They were, he said, as yet undeveloped. He had a scheme of his own for improving them, but while it was maturing, he certainly was, open to offers of work. I got him some translation. He was a fairly good French scholar. Then it was the fatality of the proceedings that impressed them on my memory. Then, I forgot to say, that at that time I was reader to a firm of publishers. These things are in themselves so inessential to the story. I turned over to him any books that came more into his province than mine. His province, I can tell you, was pretty extensive too. He began by doing me the honor to consult me about any instances that seemed doubtful. And so you see how carefully I had prepared his path for him. One afternoon he turned up at my rooms uninvited between 4 and 5. He said he remembered I had told him I should be free at that hour. He remembered. Yes, I don't think Tasker Jevons ever forgot anything likely to be useful to him in his life. And he hadn't been with me 10 minutes before Viola Thesiger came in. He was saying, "Why the heaven-afflicted idiot," his author, "should think it necessary," when Viola came in. She came in, and suddenly I made up my mind that she was beautiful. I hadn't seen it before. I don't know why I saw it now. It may have been some turn of her small, squarish head that surprised me with subtle tendernesses and curves, or more likely it may have been her effect on him. I may have seen her with his eyes. I don't know. I hardly like to think he saw anything in her I hadn't seen first. He stopped talking. They looked at each other. I introduced him. Not to have introduced him would have struck him as a slight. I ordered tea at once in the hope of hastening his departure. He had been curiously silent since she had come in, but he didn't go. He just sat there, saying nothing, but looking at her furtively now and again, and blinking, as if looking at her hurt him. Whenever she said anything, he stared, with his mouth a little open, breathing heavily. She hadn't paid very much attention to him. Then suddenly, as if intrigued by his silence, she said, "Who is the heaven-afflicted idiot?" I said, "Ask Mr. Jevons." She did. Jevons didn't answer her. He simply looked at her and blinked. Then he looked away again. "Come," I said, "you might finish what you were going to say." "I don't know," he muttered. "That I was going to say anything. Oh, yes, that thing you sent me. Why the silly blighter should suppose it's necessary to stick in a storm at sea when it's quite obvious he hasn't seen one. He talks about a brig when he means a bark, and from the way he navigates her you'd say the wind blew all ways at once in the Atlantic." I said it might for all I knew, and I asked him if he'd ever seen a storm at sea himself. It seemed he had. He'd been ordered a sea voyage for his health after a spell of printing, and his uncle, who was a sea captain, took him with him to Hong Kong in his ship, and he had been all through the cyclone in the Pacific. I got him with some difficulty, for he had become extremely shy. I got him to tell us about it. He did. And by the time he had finished with us, we had all been through a cyclone in the Pacific. It was too much. The little beast could talk almost as well as he wrote. A fellow who can write like Tasker Jevons has no business to talk at all. Viola left soon after 6. He had outstayed her. I went downstairs with her. When I came back to him, he was still staring at the doorway she had passed through. "Who's that girl?" he said. I said she was my typist. He meditated and brought out as the result, "Do you mind telling me how much she charges you?" I told him. He looked dejected. "I can't afford her," he said presently. "No, I can't possibly afford her. Not yet." He paused. "Do you mind giving me her address?" "I thought you said you couldn't afford her." "I can't. Not yet. But I will afford her. I will. I give myself another—" He stopped. His mouth fell ajar, and I saw his lips moving as he went through some inaudible calculations. "Another 6 months." He hid his face in his hands and ran his fingers through his hair. Then, as if he conceived himself to be unobserved behind this shelter, he let himself go, and I became the witness of an agony, a passion, a self-abandoned nakedness, to the utter shedding of all reticences and decencies, with nothing but those thin hands and that hair between me and it. "I'll work," he said. "I'll work like 100 bloody niggers, like 10,100,000,000,000 sweated tailors in a stinking cellar. I'll pinch, I'll skimp and save, I'll deny myself butter, I'll wear celluloid collars and sell my dress suit. My God! I'd sell the coat off my back and the shoes off my feet. I'd sell my own mother's body off her deathbed and go without any dinner for 9 months to see her again for 5 minutes. Just to see her for 5 minutes, 5 unprintable little minutes that another man wouldn't know what to do with, wouldn't use for tying up a bootlace in. Pause. I didn't know it hurt. I didn't know a girl's face could land you one like this, and her eyes jab you, and her voice turn round and round in your stomach like a circular saw. That's what it feels like, exactly. Dry up, you old geyser yourself. I'm getting it, not you. You'd spout if you'd had to sit tight with all the gas in the shop blazing away under you for the last hour. If you can turn it off at the meter, turn it. I can't. No, I won't have another cup of tea, and I won't get up and clear out. I'm going to sit here another 5 minutes. I'm not well, I tell you, and it relieves me to talk about it. I don't care if you don't listen or if you do. I'm past caring. Do you notice that I didn't speak a word to her, not one blessed word the whole time? I should have choked if I'd tried to. I didn't want to look at her, to think of her. That's why I told that rotten story, just to keep myself going. What a blethering idiot she must have thought me. What a putrid ass. The sea, and me, and the way she looked at me. I said, do you mean to say, Jevons, it didn't happen? And he groaned, oh, it happened, all right. I can't invent things to save my life. God, it isn't even as if she was pretty. I could understand that. He grabbed his throat suddenly and began to cough. I tried to be kind to him. Look here, I said, old chap, I'm awfully sorry if it takes you this way, but it's no good. He turned on me coughing and choking. I cannot remember all he said or half the things he called me, but it was something like this. You sniveling defective cough, you septic idiot cough, you poisonous and polluted ass cough, cough, cough. You scarlet imbecile. I have to water down the increasing richness of his epithets. You last diminutive purple embryo of an epileptic stock. Do you suppose I don't know that? No good? Of course it's no good yet. I got to wait for another 6 months, and you can take it from me. If a fellow knows what he wants and doesn't try to get it, doesn't know how to get it in 6 months, and doesn't find out, he's no good, if you like. These words didn't strike me at the time as having any personal application. He was to repeat them later on, however, in circumstances which I defy anybody to have foreseen. I cannot recall the precise phases of their remarkable friendship. I wasn't present at its earliest stages. I had my first intimation of its existence one evening in the winter of 1905. When he dropped in on me to consult me, he said about a rather delicate matter in which I gathered there lurked for his inexperience the most frightful pitfalls of offense. That he should come to me in this spirit was evidence that a certain chastening had been going on in him. The delicate matter was this. He had given Miss Thesiger a lot of work, the typing of a whole book, in fact, and he had immense difficulty in getting to this part of it. She had refused to take any payment. She had got it into her head that he was hard up. He had sent her a check 3 times, and 3 times she had returned it. She was as obstinate as a mule about it, and now she was saying that she had never meant him to pay her. She had done the whole thing out of friendship, which of course was very pretty of her, but it put him in a beastly position. He had never been precisely in that position before, and he didn't know what to do about it. He didn't want to offend her, and yet he didn't see, did I, how he could let her do it. It was, he said, all the wrong way about, according to his notions, and for the life of him he didn't know what to do. It might seem to me incredible that such virgin innocence as his should exist in a world where the rules for most sorts of conduct were fairly settled. He had lived all his life in an atmosphere of births, marriages, and deaths, and he knew all the rules for the registration of them. That was about all he did know, and it was the most infernally hard luck to be stumped like this at the very beginning, just when he wanted most awfully to do the right thing. Besides, it had knocked him all to bits, the sheer prettiness of it. He had laid bare for me all the curious intricacies of a soul tortured by its own delicacy. There was agony in his eyes. If he were to take this kindness from a lady, would it, in my opinion, or would it not be cricket? I didn't like to tell him that he had brought his agony on himself by his imprudence in employing a typist when he couldn't afford one. So I only said that if I knew the lady, he would find her uncommonly hard to move. He hadn't any hope, he said, of moving her, but did I think that if he made her a present, say the collected works of George Meredith, it would meet the case? I said it would meet the case all right, but that in my opinion it would spoil its prettiness. If Miss Thesiger didn't want to be paid in one way, she wouldn't at all care about being paid in another. Perhaps Miss Thesiger liked being pretty. Hadn't he better leave it at that, anyhow, for the present? You see, I looked on Viola and Viola's behavior as infinitely more my concern than his. I found myself replying for her as she would have wished me to reply, as if I could claim an intenser appreciation of her motives than was his, as if she and I were agreed about this question of helping Tasker Jevons, and I were the custodian of her generosity. He said he supposed it wouldn't hurt him to leave it at that. It wasn't as if it wouldn't be all one in the long run. He gave himself 3 months. I supposed he meant to pay her in. 3 weeks later I heard that Jevons was actually living up in Hampstead in the same house as Viola. I didn't hear it from Viola, but from my man Pavitt, who had it from his sister-in-law, and what Pavitt came to tell me was that Mr. Jevons had been ill. I went up to Hampstead that afternoon to see him. I found him in a back room at the top of the house, sitting by the fire in an easy chair wrapped in a blanket. He was as thin as a lath, and his face was a bright yellow. The very whites of his eyes were yellow. I would have said you never saw a more miserable object, but that Jevons was not miserable. He was happy, and as far as his devastated condition would allow him, he looked happy. This face, yellow with jaundice, was doing its best to smile. The smile was a grimace, not an affair of the lips at all, but of the deep crescent lines drawn at right angles to them. Still, he was smiling in a sort of ecstasy. He was smiling at Viola, who sat in the chair facing him on the other side of the hearth. She looked as if she had been there for ages, also as if she had been sitting up all night. She was smiling, too, straight at Jevons. What I saw was the beatitude of his response. He tried to smile at me, too, as I came in, but the effort was a failure. He wasn't really a bit glad to see me. Viola got up and left me with him. I wasn't to stay with him for more than 10 minutes, she said. It was the first day he had been allowed to sit up. I sat with him for 15 minutes. He was lodged as before in one room, but its domestic character was disguised by many ingenious devices, giving you the idea that it was nothing but his study. Well, there he was, haggard and yellow with jaundice, utterly pitiable as to his appearance and surroundings. Yet he looked at me in positively a sort of triumph, as much as to say, yes, here I am, and you, with all your superior resources, haven't managed half so well. And I thought that he, not knowing Viola so well as I did, was suffering from a lamentable delusion. He said she had been awfully good to him, but it was rather hard luck on him, wasn't it, that he should have gone and turned this beastly colour. I said rather loftily I didn't suppose it mattered to Viola what colour he turned. What could it matter to her? She came in presently and took me down to her sitting room and gave me tea. She owned to having sat up 3 nights with Jevons. She couldn't have believed it possible that anybody could be so ill. For 3 days and 3 nights the poor thing hadn't been able to keep anything down, not even a drop of water, but today she had been feeding him on the whites of eggs beaten up with brandy. She seemed to me to be obsessed with Jevons's illness, and I made her come out with me for 10 minutes for a blow on the heath. I tried to lead her mind to other things, and she listened politely. Then there was silence, and presently I felt her arm slide into mine. She had these adorable impulses of confidence. "Funny," she said. "What does jaundice come from?" I said it generally came from chill. She frowned, as if she were not satisfied with that explanation, and there was another silence. Then she began again. "Would being unhappy, very, very unhappy, give it you?" I thought I saw how her mind was working, and I advised her to put that idea out of her head. Happiness, I said, wouldn't be good for Jevons. She said, "Oh, wouldn't it?" And after prolonged meditation, "I wonder if he'll stay that funny yellow colour all his life." I found out from her that he had been living in that top room above hers for 3 weeks, ever since he had finished his book. It looked as if he had become frantic when he saw the end of his pretexts and occasions for meeting her, and had cast off all prudence and had followed her, determined to live under the same roof. I looked on it as a madness that possessed him, but that it should ever possess her, that was inconceivable. End of section 15 of Tasker Jevons, The Real Story by May Sinclair, Chapter 1.